I didn't do anything wrong, just had a few drinks and stayed warm under a blanket with an old friend. But my husband called it betrayal, took our children overnight, and handed me papers that shattered the life I thought I controlled. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I always told myself I was entitled to a little freedom, that one evening of laughter, a few drinks, and a harmless gesture didn't mean I had broken my vows. My name is Cyrilla Dawn, I'm 34 years old, and I work as a payroll clerk, where people see me as dependable, precise, and steady. At work, no one questions my integrity, but at home it always felt like Jonas was waiting for me to stumble. He wanted everything ordered, predictable, and under control, while I wanted moments that reminded me I was still young and not just a wife or a mother. So when my brother Leo told me to go out and relax, to stop living like an old woman tied to the stove, I listened. That night, I met a few friends at a bar, and when I saw Elias Marek, an old boyfriend from years back, walk in, I felt a spark of nostalgia. It wasn't love, not even attraction, just a piece of my old self reflected in someone else's smile. We drank, we laughed, we talked about the past, and as the night wore on, my head grew light and my steps unsteady. I should have left, I know that now, but when Elias offered me a ride, I shook my head. I didn't want him driving me home, didn't want Jonas asking questions, so I let him suggest the easier option, crash on his couch. I told myself it was safer than stumbling home, that nothing would happen, and that in the morning I could leave before anyone noticed. The apartment was dimly lit, small and cluttered, and when I lay down on the couch, Elias tossed me a blanket. I pulled it over my shoulders without thinking, grateful for the warmth. He sat in a chair nearby, sipping water, talking quietly until my eyelids grew too heavy to stay open. I don't remember much after that, just the comfort of the blanket and the dull hum of his voice. When I woke, sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, my mouth dry and my head pounding. Elias had already left for work, a note on the table saying there was coffee in the kitchen. For a moment, I believed no one would ever know, that I could leave and return to my routine without consequence. But my phone buzzed, and when I checked it, my heart sank. A message from Leo contained a picture. Me on the couch, the blanket drawn up to my chin, asleep. He wrote that someone had seen me at Elias's apartment, posted it online, and that it was already spreading. My chest tightened with dread, but I told myself it was just gossip, that if I acted unfazed, it would pass. When I walked through the front door of our home later that morning, Jonas was waiting. He sat at the kitchen table, arms folded, his face pale and unreadable. He asked me where I had been. I smiled tightly and said work had gone late, that I'd had a few drinks with friends, that I was too tired to explain the details. He asked if I had been alone. I shook my head and said he was imagining things again, that he always looked for shadows where there was none. I called him paranoid, said he was trying to suffocate me with his constant suspicion. His jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at me, then at the phone in his hand. He turned the screen so I could see the photo, and my stomach dropped. I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss it. I told him it was ridiculous, that I had been tipsy and slept on the couch for safety, nothing more. I asked him if he would rather I had driven home drunk, if he would prefer I risk my life just to avoid a picture. I tried to flip the story, to make him feel guilty for being angry. He said quietly that it looked like betrayal to him. I told him he always needed to dramatize, always twisted harmless moments into crimes. I insisted the real problem was his insecurity, not my choices. He didn't argue further, didn't shout or accuse. He just stood and left the room, his silence echoing louder than any words could have. That afternoon, I called Leo, my voice sharp with indignation. I told him Jonas was furious, that he was making a scene over nothing. Leo laughed, saying Jonas had always been uptight, that men couldn't stand to see women enjoy themselves. He told me not to worry, that Jonas would calm down once he realized I wasn't going to beg for forgiveness. His easy confidence soothed me for a while, convincing me I had done nothing wrong. I repeated his words in my head like armor. Jonas was too strict, too serious, too controlling. I told myself I was the reasonable one. But as the day wore on, I noticed Ivy watching me with wary eyes. She didn't ask questions, but her silence cut through my excuses. She lingered at the doorway while I made dinner, clutching her doll, her small face serious. I told her Daddy was just upset, that grown-ups sometimes fought, but her eyes didn't soften. She turned and walked away, leaving me with a hollow feeling I couldn't shake. That night, Jonas didn't join me in bed. He slept in the guest room, and the sound of his even breathing through the wall reminded me he was choosing distance over confrontation. I told myself it was better than yelling, but the truth was, his silence frightened me more than his anger ever had. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, repeating again and again that I hadn't cheated, that it was just a blanket, just exhaustion, nothing more. Yet even as I whispered the words, they rang hollow in the quiet house, and I realized for the first time that Jonas wasn't going to forget this time. His silence was not surrender, it was preparation. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had always been loud, messy, and filled with chatter, but that evening every sound felt heavy, strained, and weighted with expectation. I walked in with a forced smile, holding a dish I barely cared about, determined to appear unbothered. Jonas followed, his steps slower, his eyes fixed straight ahead, carrying Ivy's bag in one hand. My parents greeted us warmly, trying to disguise the tension, but I could see the way their eyes flicked nervously between me and Jonas. Leo was already there, sprawled on the couch with his usual smirk, eager to make jokes at Daniel's expense the way he always did. At the table, plates filled, conversations started and stopped, and though I tried to talk about work or the weather, I knew everyone was waiting for Jonas to speak. He stayed quiet, eating little, his silence louder than all the clinking forks around him. When he finally moved, it was deliberate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and laid it in the middle of the table like a piece of evidence. The photo glared back at all of us, me, asleep on Elias's couch, the blanket wrapped snugly over me, the timestamp glowing at the corner. My mother gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding my eyes. Leo leaned back with a laugh, waving his hand dismissively and saying Jonas was making a big deal out of nothing. He told him women had a right to enjoy themselves, that a couch wasn't a sin. His words gave me the courage I needed. I laughed too, though my stomach churned, and I said Jonas had embarrassed me enough. I told everyone that I had been tipsy, that I had chosen safety over recklessness, and that I didn't deserve to be attacked for a responsible decision. I called Jonas paranoid, accused him of dramatizing everything, said he was twisting a moment of rest into a crime of betrayal. I even added that if he loved me, he would trust me instead of looking for reasons to humiliate me in front of family. My voice was steady, smooth, like I had rehearsed it, and I looked around the table as if daring anyone to contradict me. But then Marion, his mother, slammed her fork against her plate. Her voice cut through the air like a knife as she said no faithful wife spent the night in another man's apartment, drunk or not. She told me I had shamed her son and confused her granddaughter, and that I was tearing the family apart. Her fury startled everyone into silence. I snapped back, insisting she had never liked me, that she was using this as an excuse to finally drive me away. I told her she was old-fashioned, controlling, and bitter. But my words sounded shrill, desperate, compared to her blunt conviction. My mother cleared her throat and tried to smooth things over, muttering that couples argued, that this would pass, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. My father said quietly that the children deserved peace, not drama. Their neutrality was a condemnation in itself. Jonas didn't rise to defend me, didn't shout, didn't argue. He stood slowly, pushed his chair back, and left the table. At first, I thought he was stepping outside to calm down, but then he returned moments later with Ivy's small backpack slung over his shoulder. He also carried his own duffel bag, the one he always packed for trips. My heart seized as I realized he had prepared for this, that he had brought the bags with him, waiting for the moment to walk out. Ivy looked at him with confusion, but didn't resist when he took her hand. He said nothing to the table, didn't look at me, didn't explain himself. He simply turned and walked out with our daughter. The sound of the front door closing was deafening. Everyone sat frozen, the food untouched, the atmosphere shattered. I felt heat rush through me, and I tried to laugh again, to say he was being dramatic, that he would be back by morning. Felix smirked and told me Jonas just needed to grow up, that he was throwing a tantrum. I clung to his words, repeating them, insisting Jonas had always been too sensitive, but Marian's eyes burned into me across the table. She said quietly that her son had finally grown tired of humiliation, and that I should prepare for the consequences. Her words struck deeper than I wanted to admit, and though I rolled my eyes, my hands shook under the table. That night, when I returned to the family home, the emptiness was unbearable. Jonas's shoes were gone from the hallway, his jacket missing from the hook, Ivy's favorite stuffed animal absent from her bed. I called him, desperate for answers, but he didn't pick up. I left messages, angry ones at first, accusing him of kidnapping our child, then pleading ones, begging him to come home. His silence was more terrifying than any argument. When Leo texted me later, saying Jonas would crawl back once he realized he couldn't handle being alone, I clung to the words like a lifeline. I told myself it was true, that Jonas was posturing, that he would come back to me as he always had. But as I lay in bed, staring at the empty side where he once slept, the shadows in the room pressed down on me. I whispered to myself over and over that I hadn't cheated, that it was just a blanket, just exhaustion, just a mistake blown out of proportion. Yet even as I said the words, they echoed hollow in the silence. Jonas hadn't shouted, hadn't raged, hadn't begged me to explain. He had simply taken our daughter and walked away, and something in his silence told me this time he wasn't coming back on my terms. When I pulled into the driveway 2 days later, the lights inside the house glowed warmly, but the moment I slid my key into the lock, the truth struck me. It no longer fit. I twisted harder, convinced it was stuck, but the door refused to budge. My chest tightened as I pounded on the wood, calling Jonas's name, demanding he open up. For a long moment there was only silence, then the faint sound of footsteps. The door cracked open just enough for him to slide an envelope through. His face was calm, unreadable, and his voice steady as he said, I should find somewhere else to stay until things were resolved. I shouted that he couldn't do this, that he was overreacting, that it was still my house, my family, my life. But he only shook his head once, closed the door, and locked it again. I stood there frozen, the envelope trembling in my hand, neighbors' curtains twitching as they peeked out at the scene. Inside the envelope were separation papers, crisp and official, my name stamped across the top. My stomach churned with rage and disbelief. I called Leo immediately, my words spilling over each other, as I told him Jonas had locked me out like a stranger. Leo laughed, saying Jonas was playing games, that men loved to act tough until they realized they couldn't survive on their own. He told me not to worry, that the papers were just a scare tactic. His confidence gave me something to cling to, but when I hung up, I looked back at the glowing windows of the house and felt the sting of exclusion. Everything inside, the photographs, the couch, Ivy's room, belonged to me too, yet I stood outside like an intruder. The humiliation was unbearable. The next day, I returned in the afternoon, timing it when I knew Ivy would be home from school. I knocked softly, rehearsing what I would say, that I missed her, that Daddy was just confused, that soon things would be back to normal. The door opened a crack, and Jonas appeared. His eyes were calm, his tone almost polite, as he handed me another envelope. This one contained visitation schedules and financial notes written in his lawyer's careful language. I tried to push my way inside, but he blocked the doorway with ease. I accused him of cruelty, of brainwashing our daughter, of turning her against me. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He only repeated that everything I needed was in the letter. Over his shoulder, I saw Ivy peeking from the hallway, clutching the railing. I reached for her, calling her name, but Jonas closed the door firmly. I shouted, pounding on the wood until my knuckles hurt, but no sound came from within. Later that night, I drove to my parents' house, demanding they take my side. My mother looked troubled, saying Jonas seemed serious, that maybe I should speak to a lawyer. My father shook his head, muttering that vows were sacred and should not be taken lightly. Their hesitation cut deeper than open judgment. Only Leo stayed firmly in my corner, smirking as he told me Jonas was being dramatic, that he would cave soon. But even his confidence felt thinner than before, his tone less sure. By the end of the week, I found myself outside the school again, desperate to see Ivy. When the children spilled from the doors, I spotted her immediately, her backpack bouncing against her small frame. I called her name, crouching to greet her, but she froze. Jonas was right behind her, his hand steady on her shoulder. I told her I had missed her, that I had ice cream waiting, but her eyes darted nervously between us. She whispered that she wanted to go home with Daddy. My chest ached as Jonas guided her away, his gaze steady, his silence louder than any insult. Other parents watched, whispering, their eyes slicing through me with quiet judgment. When I returned to the apartment I had rented in haste, another envelope waited in my mailbox. This one bore the official stamp of Jonas's lawyer, outlining custody petitions and financial freezes. My hand shook as I read, and for the first time, fear pierced through my anger. He wasn't just posturing, he was building something permanent, and every step left me weaker. I poured myself a drink and whispered again and again that it was only a blanket, only exhaustion, nothing more. But the words no longer soothed me. They sounded like excuses even to my own ears. At work, things grew worse. Gossip about the blanket spread like wildfire. Colleagues whispered behind my back, and one even asked if I really thought a couch was innocent. I forced a smile, insisting Jonas was controlling, that people loved drama, but their skeptical eyes told me the verdict had already been decided. The humiliation burned. By the weekend, desperation drove me back to the house. I stood on the porch again, pounding on the door, screaming that Jonas couldn't erase me, that Ivy needed her mother. This time, the door opened wider, but not by him alone. His lawyer stood beside him, folder in hand. Calmly, he explained that I was no longer permitted inside until further rulings. He handed me yet another packet, filled with legal language I barely understood. I screamed that they were conspiring against me, trying to steal my family. Jonas said nothing. He just stood there, firm and unyielding, while Ivy peeked again from the staircase, her small face pale and withdrawn. I reached toward her, but she turned away and vanished into the shadows upstairs. The door shut once more, leaving me on the porch with the folder pressed to my chest, shaking. The neighbors' blinds shifted, their eyes burning into me. For the first time, I felt not like a victim, but like an outsider in my own life. I whispered the same denial I always had. I hadn't cheated. I hadn't betrayed. It was just a blanket. But in that moment, even I began to wonder if words could undo what had already been set in motion. I thought if I could control the story, I could still control the outcome. So I threw myself into appearances. At the payroll office, I smiled at everyone as if nothing had happened, making light jokes at the copier, asking about their weekends, pretending my life hadn't split down the middle. But whispers followed me like shadows. I overheard two women whisper that, A blanket with an X means more than she admits, and another asked if Jonas had really taken Ivy away. I forced a laugh when a coworker asked if I'd gotten enough rest on Elias's couch, pretending I wasn't humiliated. The truth was every whisper felt like a verdict. Daniel's silence gave people permission to imagine their own version of events, and I could see that version painted against me everywhere I turned. At the next family dinner, the tension suffocated me. Jonas didn't come, which was somehow worse than if he had. His absence was a presence in itself. My mother tried to start conversations about Ivy's schoolwork. My father muttered about the weather, but soon enough the subject circled back to me. Leo leaned back, arms crossed, smirking as he said Jonas was making a fool of himself, that no man should throw his life away over a blanket. His easy dismissal soothed me, and I repeated his words, saying Jonas had always been insecure, always desperate to play the victim. But Marian's voice cut through the room like glass breaking. She said Leo was blind, that I had shamed her son, and that Ivy was the one paying the price. I snapped back, saying she'd hated me from the start, that she was happy to see me fall. My mother whispered that we should all calm down, but her face told me she agreed more with Marian than with me. My father just shook his head, disappointment heavy in his eyes. Later, I tried to talk to Ivy privately, crouching down to her level and telling her Daddy was just angry, that soon everything would be back to normal. She nodded, but her eyes didn't brighten. When I reached for her hand, she pulled it back, mumbling she wanted to go home. The sting of rejection burned deeper than any scolding Marian had given me. Still, I refused to accept responsibility. I told myself Jonas had filled her head with poison, teaching her to see me as the villain. In the days that followed, I started rewriting the story for anyone who would listen. I told coworkers, friends, even neighbors, that Jonas had locked me out for no reason, that he was cruel, that he couldn't handle me having friendships. Some nodded politely, but others gave me looks that said they weren't convinced. One friend asked softly why I hadn't just called Jonas that night, why I hadn't taken a cab home. I snapped, saying she didn't understand, but her silence afterward was its own judgment. I could feel the support slipping from under me, leaving me isolated. Determined to prove I still had a place, I showed up at Ivy's school unannounced. I wanted to take her for ice cream, to remind her that I was still her mother, still capable of giving her joy. I saw her walking out of the building, clutching her backpack straps, and my heart leapt. I called her name, crouched down with a smile, but she froze. Jonas was already there, standing beside her with his steady hand on her shoulder. He said in a low voice that it wasn't my visitation day. I argued that he was cruel, that he was stealing time from me, but Ivy's eyes filled with tears. She pressed closer to him, choosing his calm over my desperation. Parents watched from the parking lot, their whispers carrying. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, the humiliation of being seen as unfit, desperate, weak. Jonas didn't argue further. He simply guided Ivy away, leaving me standing alone with nothing but my shame. That night, I poured wine into a glass and called Leo, telling him Jonas was turning everyone against me. He said Jonas was bluffing, that the courts wouldn't side with him in the end, but even his tone lacked its usual bravado. His reassurances rang hollow, and I felt the chill of doubt for the first time. A few days later, another envelope arrived in the mail. This one bore the court seal, a petition for temporary custody filed by Jonas. The words blurred as I read them, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't bluffing. He was dismantling me piece by piece, using the law to build a wall I couldn't climb. My hands shook as I held the paper, fear pressing down harder than anger ever had. For the first time, I wondered if I was losing more than a husband. I was losing my daughter. At the following family dinner, the walls closed in tighter. Marian refused to look at me. My mother's silence was heavy. My father sighed, and even Leo sounded less sure when he tried to defend me. He mumbled something about people exaggerating, but his voice trailed off when no one supported him. I looked across the table at Ivy, who sat quietly, poking at her food, refusing to meet my eyes. The weight of her silence crushed me more than Marian's fury. I wanted to shout, to demand she see me as her mother, but I couldn't find the words. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the custody petition again. I whispered to myself that it was still only a blanket, still only one night, that Jonas was cruel for making it into more. But as the words left my mouth, they sounded brittle, weak, like lies even I no longer believed. Jonas's silence, his calm, his patience, all of it was more powerful than my denials. I realized then he was no longer reacting to me. He was building his case, brick by brick, and the walls were closing in. The legal office felt nothing like the battleground I had prepared for in my head. I walked in expecting anger, raised voices, accusations I could twist and spin into sympathy for myself. Instead, the atmosphere was controlled, deliberate, almost surgical. Jonas sat across from me, his lawyer at his side, a folder neatly stacked in front of them. He looked calm, detached, as though this wasn't about me at all, but about a problem he had already solved. My own lawyer shuffled papers nervously, whispering about procedure, but I barely listened. I wanted to shatter the silence, to laugh off the seriousness of it all, to say it was absurd we were even here because of a single photo and a blanket. But when Jonas's lawyer opened the folder, my words caught in my throat. The first document laid out was a formal custody petition, stamped and filed. My name stared back at me, the request clearly stating temporary custody should be granted to Jonas for Ivy's stability. I snapped that this was insane, that he was trying to erase me from my own daughter's life, but Jonas didn't rise to the bait. His lawyer calmly explained the grounds. The photos circulating online, the witness accounts from the bar, the public arguments that had unsettled Ivy, and the fact that Jonas had taken immediate steps to ensure her routine remained undisturbed. I slammed my palm against the table, demanding to know how sleeping under a blanket was proof of anything. My lawyer tried to caution me with a glance, but I ignored him. I called it paranoia, dressed up in paperwork. Jonas's lawyer didn't flinch. He slid another packet across the table. Financial documents. Our joint accounts had already been frozen. New protections were in place to secure Ivy's savings. Bills had been reassigned, insurance adjusted, everything was stamped, notarized, finalized. I stared at the pages, my fingers trembling, heat rushing into my cheeks. I accused Jonas of cruelty, of trying to ruin me financially, of using law as a weapon. But his lawyer calmly repeated that these were not punishments, they were safeguards, proof of responsibility. Jonas still hadn't said a word. I turned my fury on him then, demanding he speak, demanding he look at me. But when he finally did, his expression wasn't angry. It was steady, almost pitying. He said quietly that he wasn't doing this to destroy me, but to protect Ivy from chaos. His voice carried more weight than my shouting ever could. I laughed bitterly, telling everyone in the room he was playing the hero, but my laugh sounded hollow, brittle. Even my own lawyer shifted uncomfortably, unable to fully defend me. When the meeting ended, Jonas gathered his papers neatly, stood and left with his lawyer. I sat frozen, staring at the custody petition in front of me. The words swam in my vision, but I understood them well enough. He was building a case that would strip me of control. I left the office clutching the documents to my chest, my body shaking with rage I couldn't contain. That night, back in my apartment, I opened my phone banking app only to find my access restricted. The accounts were locked, exactly as the lawyer had said. I screamed into the empty room, throwing the phone across the floor, my chest heaving. I called Leo, begging for reassurance, and he told me courts never sided with fathers, that this was just a show of force. He told me not to panic, that it would blow over, but his voice lacked conviction, and for the first time I heard doubt creep into his tone. I hung up quickly, refusing to let his uncertainty seep into me. The next visitation day, Ivy sat stiffly on the couch in my small apartment, her backpack at her feet. I tried too hard to make the time special, filling the silence with stories, offering snacks, asking questions she didn't answer. She looked at me with eyes older than her years and asked why Daddy was so sad, why people at school whispered, why other kids' mothers asked strange questions. My throat tightened, but I forced a smile, saying Daddy was making things bigger than they were, that soon it would all be fine. She nodded politely, but didn't smile. She kept her hands folded in her lap, as though bracing herself. When it was time for Jonas to pick her up, she hugged me briefly, but pressed closer to him the moment he arrived. Watching her walk out the door, my chest felt hollow, as if the space between us had grown into a canyon I couldn't cross. A week later, another meeting was scheduled, and I walked in, braced for more humiliation. Jonas's lawyer presented new evidence. Witness statements from people at the bar saying I had leaned against Elias, laughing like we were more than friends. Text logs showed I had told Jonas I was working late that night, proof of lies stacked neatly on the table. Each page felt like a hammer, driving nails into a coffin I couldn't pry open. I sputtered excuses, saying everyone had misinterpreted, saying it was harmless, but the words tasted like ash. Even my lawyer avoided my gaze, his sigh betraying his doubt. Jonas sat steady, speaking only when asked, his words clear and measured. He didn't accuse me with venom. He simply let the documents speak. The calmness of his approach made me look wild, unbalanced, desperate. When the meeting ended, Jonas stood again, collected his papers, and walked out without looking back. I sat behind, frozen, staring at the evidence stacked in front of me. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what he had built, a fortress of facts, signed papers, and lawful steps that I couldn't tear down with laughter, excuses, or gaslighting. My denials no longer mattered. His silence and preparation had outplayed me completely. As I drove home that evening, the folder sat on the passenger seat like a stone pressing into my chest. I whispered aloud over and over that it had only been a blanket, only one night, only a harmless mistake. But even I could hear the weakness in my voice, the disbelief. The law didn't care about my excuses, and Jonas no longer needed to argue. He had already won. The courtroom was nothing like the shouting matches I had imagined, nothing like the emotional battles I had prepared myself for. It was cold, orderly, and quiet, every sound magnified, the shuffle of papers, the scrape of chairs, the low coughs echoing off the walls. I sat at my table, my lawyer beside me, while Jonas sat across the aisle, his posture straight, his lawyer calm and efficient with a stack of folders neatly arranged in front of him. He didn't even look at me at first, which infuriated me more than if he had glared. When the judge entered, the silence deepened, and I felt my heart pound in my chest like it was trying to escape. The proceedings began with Jonas's lawyer laying out the evidence, one careful piece at a time. First came the photo, the one that had followed me everywhere, the one I had laughed off 100 times already. There it was on the court screen. Me, asleep under a blanket at Elias's apartment. I wanted to shout that it was nothing, just exhaustion, but the lawyer didn't stop there. Witness statements were read from people at the bar, describing how I had leaned close to Elias, laughing, how it looked to them like more than friendship. I shook my head furiously, muttering to myself that they were lying, but the words had no weight in that room. Then came the text logs. Jonas's lawyer presented messages where I had told my husband I was working late, the very night I ended up at Elias's apartment. The contradiction was sharp, undeniable, and I felt my throat tighten. My lawyer tried to object, tried to argue context, but the judge's eyes turned to me with sharp questions. Why hadn't I called my husband that night? Why had I chosen to stay at an ex's apartment instead of coming home? Why had I lied about where I was? I fumbled with my answers, repeating again and again that it was harmless, that nothing physical had happened, that I had been tired and careless. But the words sounded rehearsed, brittle, like excuses I barely believed myself. When it was Jonas's turn to speak, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me with anger or bitterness. He spoke softly, steadily, outlining his actions like a man presenting a plan he had already carried out. He explained how he had acted to protect Ivy's well-being, how he had secured the accounts to ensure her future, how he had filed for custody not out of revenge but out of necessity. His calmness was devastating. Every word painted him as the steady parent, the protector, while I sat across from him trembling and desperate. His silence over the past weeks now revealed itself as strategy. While I had wasted energy spinning stories and defending myself with half-truths, he had been documenting, gathering, building a fortress of evidence. The judge listened, asked a few pointed questions, and leaned back in his chair. I wanted to scream, to tell him Jonas was manipulating the system, but the evidence sat stacked against me, every page stamped, signed, and sealed. My lawyer tried to salvage something, arguing that a mother's bond with her child should never be severed, that one mistake shouldn't outweigh years of care. But the judge's ruling was already forming. I could see it in his eyes. When the decision came, it felt like the floor beneath me gave way. Temporary custody was awarded to Jonas. Financial accounts would remain secured under his management. My visitation rights were reduced to a strict schedule, supervised until further evaluation. The words echoed in my ears, heavy and final. I opened my mouth to protest, but no sound came. I stared at the judge, then at Jonas, who finally turned his eyes toward me. He didn't look triumphant, didn't look vengeful. He looked at me with pity, as if I were a stranger he once knew but could no longer recognize. That expression cut deeper than anger ever could. I looked for Ivy, desperate for her to run into my arms, but she sat quietly beside Marion, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't meet my eyes. When Jonas reached for her, she stood and walked with him without hesitation. I felt something inside me collapse. All my justifications, all my denials, all the gaslighting I had leaned on for so long suddenly felt like fragile glass shattered on the floor. Jonas hadn't needed to fight me with rage. He had simply outlasted me with patience and the weight of truth. As the gavel struck, the sound echoed through me like a door slamming shut. Papers were handed across the tables, schedules outlined, signatures demanded. My lawyer placed them in front of me, but my vision blurred. I scrawled my name mechanically, my hand trembling so badly I could barely hold the pen. Each stroke felt like surrender. Walking out of the courthouse, the sky seemed too bright, the world too normal for the ruin I carried inside. I clutched the papers in my hands, their weight heavier than any blanket I had ever pulled over myself. I whispered aloud, desperate to hear my own voice. It was just a blanket, just a mistake, nothing more. But the words rang empty, lifeless. The law had spoken, Jonas had won, and I was left standing alone, stripped of control, my denials drowned by the silence of a judgment I could not undo. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.